Up next, we have this story on Afghanistan, where the U.S. over the past couple of days has conducted several strikes in the Helmand province. This is in southwest Afghanistan, definitely Pashtunistan, heavy Taliban presence there. And it doesn't seem like these fighters were necessarily um, violating the peace deal, but the U.S. claims they were and carried out all these strikes, which seemed to me to be a violation of the peace deal. That the Taliban are not necessarily no longer at war with the Afghan government, and so this is probably creating quite a stir in Afghanistan. We also have the talks that are supposed to be going on in Qatar right now between the Taliban and the Afghan government. What do you think of this situation here?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now, I don't think that much is known about the US strikes themselves, like how many they actually did, the number of targets or casualties or anything like that. We just have the DoD spokesperson, which, if you're watching the video version of the show, you can see those tweets on the screen from Colonel Sonny Leggett. He basically just said there were several strikes in Helmand, and that is sort of like the Taliban's like stronghold in Afghanistan. It's where they hold a lot of they have the most control and sway in the country. The Afghan government came out separately and claimed that they killed 170 fighters in this whole incident. But I'm always very, we've talked before about their numbers are, not usually very trustworthy. They often will inflate or deflate numbers depending on, what their interest is. However, we do have a statement out from the Taliban, who like their spokesperson also came out on Twitter, put out a statement, and he was claiming that they were basically just retaking their own territory that the government had captured from them a couple months prior. And they were saying that like locals in the area had been complaining of like bandits and looters and stuff, which definitely that does happen in Afghanistan. There are like highwaymen and stuff. I'm not sure if like what the spokesperson is saying is legit in this case, but that was their argument for why this whole thing was justified and why this is not any kind of violation of the deal. They're saying this territory was fair and square, belonged to them. They were taking it back. However, like I guess the fact that I would even say this is kind of a good sign, but like these type of strikes by the U.S. like on the Taliban have seemingly become kind of rare nowadays. At least like definitely compared to previous phases of the war, we don't really see the U.S. taking these like retaliatory operations that much, especially since signing the deal with the Taliban in February. Um, and it's kind of weird. Like U.S. officials have repeatedly said that the Taliban has held up their end of the deal in terms of like halting direct attacks on American troops, because that is what they were supposed to do under the agreement. However, the Taliban has definitely not let up on attacking the local Afghan forces, which was not apparently not part of the deal with the Taliban. And they seem to be doing that fairly regularly now, carrying out these attacks, even during the talks in Qatar. Um, and the U.S. Taliban deal does mention something about the Taliban not attacking U.S. allies. And U.S. officials regularly talk about the Afghans as if they're allies. But technically, like, we don't have any kind of mutual defense treaty with them or anything. They're technically not our allies. And like in practice too, Washington has not really been treating them as allies in the sense that like they're not retaliating to attacks on local forces over the last 8 months or so, with only minor exceptions like what we're seeing over the weekend. It's certainly possible the U.S. is they are carrying out these strikes. They're just not publicizing them. But if they were doing that, you would expect the Taliban to like be talking about that more and complaining about it more. And we're not really seeing that. So I do tend to think they've scaled back the operations. But the provision in the deal, though, about like U.S. allies doesn't seem to apply to the Afghan government. Like that's not how the U.S. has been treating it, for the last 8 months or so. And in that case, I'm not sure how they would justify these strikes in Helmand over the weekend. The DoD spokesperson said that they were consistent with the deal, but he didn't get into how. He didn't really explain that at all. It would seem, though, pretty arbitrary for them just to suddenly decide that the Afghans do count as allies and that we will now start retaliating to any attacks that the Taliban might launch on them, despite taking like a very different stance for several months after a bunch of different Taliban offensives. So I don't really know how they intend to explain any of this. Maybe they won't even try. But I guess I could see them just trying to say that, like, no, we have the right to defend our Afghan partners under the current agreement, even if it doesn't. I don't think it explicitly says that.
Yeah, that seems to was what really caught my attention, was that it doesn't seem that they were able to at least argue that any members of the U.S. forces or our allied like NATO coalition forces that may still be operating in Afghanistan were under threat here. It's not like the Taliban were attacking a new base that houses some kind of international forces, but rather they were just launching an offensive against the Afghan government, which at least for the first several months of this deal, appeared to be fair game. And
Right.
so, why the U.S. would start carrying out strikes to turn them back is curious. Now, I read the statement from the Taliban that said that they were just recapturing territory. When I read the Reuters story on this, they wrote it up as the Taliban were in the midst of an offensive where they were going to take positions that would give them more control around the capital of the Helmand province, Lashkar. And if that were the case, then they could potentially mount an offensive against the city and maybe take the city out. I mean, it's been several years since it seems like the Taliban have really tried to take and hold a big city. You know, they've gone to Kandahar, Farah City, I think Ghani are all like cities they've entered in the past several years, but they've always left like immediately. So I'm not sure what the strategy is here, other than maybe to help protect that city. But in that case, you know, this isn't a part or doesn't really fit within the peace agreement that they signed. And so that seems to at least be somewhat problematic to me that, you know, the U.S. is now carrying out these airstrikes. Although from the Taliban statement, it didn't sound like they were wholly upset with it and saying that, oh, we're now going to retaliate by trying to target U.S. forces or something like that. But rather, they just kind of dismissed the claim by the U.S. that they were like carrying out these particularly aggressive actions in Helmand or something like that. Will, any more details on this?
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on something you said, I think it is very possible the Taliban are just trying to get some bargaining chips in Helmand, some extra territory while they're, doing these talks. Because, like, as you're saying, like, I think you've made this point on the show previously, but like at some point in the talks, they're going to have to start deciding like who has what territory, and I think they want to make sure they have the most they can bargain with before that point in the negotiations. And as far as we know, I think the talks are still at very early stages. They are not quite at like hammering out who gets what territory or any kind of power sharing or anything like that. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case. Essentially, anytime you're talking about, you know, having a ceasefire take effect in a few days or a few months or whenever, it always seems to make both sides desperate to take as much territory as possible prior to the ceasefire, because then obviously you can't. But whatever territory you have, you get to negotiate with during the ceasefire, and so you
right.
sometimes, you know, especially these ceasefires that don't really last for more than a couple hours, aren't necessarily beneficial. They just ramp up fighting, and then, you know, a couple hours later it dissolves and they go back to